So I know I said deviance was my favorite chapter. So I guess stratification is my second favorite chapter, or maybe they are co-favorite chapters. But I'm really excited about this one because I'm really passionate about inequality and social justice. And so we're going to be talking about stratification or the structural ranking of groups of people in a society based on their access to economic and power rewards. And we'll get into a less technical definition of that, and I'll give you some characteristics momentarily. But I do want to emphasize that one of the things that we focus on in in this discussion of stratification is that ranking. And so basically, the fact that within a social stratification system, there is social inequality, that there is a variation of wealth, power, and prestige among the members of a society. And so let's get into it. So let's start by differentiating between some terms that we use commonly, but that have very specific definitions in the social sciences. First, we have wealth versus income. So with wealth, this is all of an individual's material assets, property, land, stocks, etc., everything that they have that isn't liquid but could become liquid if necessary. Income, however, is money that you expect to be coming in. So like wages, salary, interest that you're building material from your assets, stocks and dividends, any money that comes in from rental properties or anything like that. And so it's really important for you to acknowledge that wealth and income don't necessarily go hand in hand. Someone can have a really high income and no generational wealth. And likewise, somebody can be very wealthy and not have an income. Maybe they don't have a job. And maybe they don't have any money coming in, but they do have like a lot of property or something that they own. So again, they don't go hand in hand. Often it does seem that way, but that's not always the case. Now, another word or another set of terms that we need to differentiate between is prestige versus esteem. So, this is important because our positions in society aren't just ranked by how much money we have or how much wealth we have, but there's also kind of a judgment on the amount of honor that is connected to one's position. And so, we actually describe that honor that's connected to a person's position in a society as prestige, right? And so, some of our positions are ranked as having more prestige or more honor than others. So, for example, if you thought about occupational prestige, you could look at some positions in society, like being a doctor or a lawyer, and view obviously that we hold those positions to a higher level of honor. Um, when our kids are growing up, there are certain positions we want them to say, "I want to be a blank when I grow up," and some that we really don't want to hear because they have lower prestige. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have something called esteem. And esteem is actually about how well somebody is regarded within their position, right? So this is your actual reputation in that position. And so somebody can have a low prestige position, but if they're like the best at it and they have a great work ethic, then they'll be considered as someone who has high esteem, or they'll be held in high esteem. And so, you have some lawyers who, of course, usually having a law degree means that you have high prestige. But because they're kind of scummy, or it's like, the Better Call Saul situation, often they'll be viewed as having low esteem. Another thing that's important to looking at our positions in stratification systems is power. And so to fill in the blank for number three, money, respect, and power are pretty important elements in that ranking. So power is defined as your ability to influence your own life and perhaps the lives of others, or the ability to exercise your will over yourself and over your other. Having power to make your own choices and do what you want is already a big deal. And so having power to make others do what you want as well, that is like amazing. And so power and the amount of power you have over people in a position um, is also influential for that ranking. When we take all of this together, we get to something called SES, or socioeconomic status. And that really takes all of these factors into consideration. It's not an exact science and shows what an individual's position is in a stratified social order, right? And so you might say somebody has a high socioeconomic status, even though they're not wealthy. And maybe they don't even have a high level of income, but because they have a very prestigious position, they may be very well educated, and they may be held at high esteem, right? So it really varies how the equation works out. And I've already given you the definition for social inequality, that variation of wealth, power, and prestige among members of a society. But when it comes to social equality, that's where there's an absence of that variation and where everyone has similar access to wealth, power, and prestige, and basically access to a similar level of lifestyle. Another term that I want to introduce that is ideology, because ideology actually is what is used to justify our system of social stratification in our society. Ideology is actually the cultural belief systems that are used to rationalize how we stratify. So the idea that one can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that everyone has a fair shot as long as you work hard, that's part of our ideology in the United States. Other elements of US ideology could include things like the belief that people should spend most of their time in life at work, or the belief that, you know, um, that work is the number one thing in life, maybe only second to family, if that, actually. So we have all these cultural belief systems that justify why we have our system of stratification. And in a moment, we're going to go into those different types of systems of stratification as well and compare them. So, yeah, ideology is pretty important. It kind of gives us a purpose and some sense of accomplishment as well. But again, it's cultural, so that means that we're creating that sense of purpose. If our ideology is that capitalism is good, right? That doesn't mean it's necessarily true, but it means that that's the belief system that we're operating under, and that justifies our system of stratification. All right, so the systems of stratification um, basically are categorized as being closed systems or open systems. A closed system of stratification accommodates little change in social position. It doesn't really allow people to shift levels, and it doesn't permit social relationships between levels either. Open systems, however, are based on achievement, and they allow for movement and interaction between layers in classes. So if you look at the four systems of stratification that I have listed here, you'll notice that they are in order of most closed to most open system of stratification. All right, so let's look over those systems of stratification now. So slavery is the most extreme system of stratification for pretty obvious reasons. You have no power over yourself or anyone else, not even your own children. Usually, in systems of stratification, in slavery systems, like in the United States history of slavery with the chattel slavery system, where literally you were considered to be human property, similar to livestock. It also means that there's no movement from one level to another. If you were born into enslavement, then typically enslavement would be passed on to your offspring as well. We also have the caste system, which has division of labor that's based on ascribed status. So basically, again, you're born into it. And it could be based on religion that's passed down through birth, or race or ethnicity, or something else. In caste systems, the castes are exclusive, meaning that there's a little interaction between the different levels of castes, and there's little mobility. Again, you don't move around. We call these endogamous because of their social closure, because of the exclusivity. and there's not a high likelihood of people marrying outside of their caste. And so you might remember that some of the most famous caste systems, which are no longer technically legal today, are India's caste system, and then you could also look at South Africa's apartheid system. And caste systems are so strong that even after they're no longer legitimate, you can see the remnants of them, the legacy of them still lingering. The estate system is also a system of stratification. And this is, probably the system that was the most I guess the most obvious or most overt prior to capitalism, and it's also known as the feudal estate system. And so here, there's more of a political basis where there are laws that are written, and rights and duties are what separates individuals and distributes power unequally. And so there are certain people who have political participation. These are people who are typically wealthier landowners, and in certain social groups or estates. And there's usually little mobility among these different estates here. So you may have the clergy, the nobility, and then you have the commoners, the people who actually like work the land. Um, and social reproduction was the norm. Whatever your parents were going to be, that's what you were going to be also. However, this is a bit different from a caste system because the relationship with it was a bit more reciprocal, and I'm not saying that it was equal at all or that it was pleasant, especially for the peasants or the commoners. But the commoners were working the land that was owned by the noble people, owned by the warriors, who in turn offered protection to the commoners, and so on. And so it was more of a reciprocal relationship than caste or slavery system. And then we have the class system, which is an ideology. I mean, sorry, it was just an ideal system because we don't really have a good example of a pure class system. Um, with the class system, it's supposed to be the most open system of stratification, where there's more mobility, where exogamy or like marriage and partnership between people of different social categories can occur. It still doesn't occur as often as one might think, and where that's based on meritocracy, which I like that your text mentions is hypothetical, right? Um, and that the position is based on effort, merit, and achievement. And again, purely hypothetical because we know that things like social capital actually do matter. That it's not necessarily what you know, but who you know that matters. But again, it's one of the most openly mobile systems of stratification. So yeah. Um, so next we're going to talk about the American class structure and take a look at that. So one of the ways that we look at our U.S. class system is by looking at class traits, also known as class markers. And these are the typical behaviors and customs and norms that we associate with each class in society. Usually we use those class traits to indicate the level of exposure that a person has to a wide range of cultures. So the more exposure, perhaps, the higher class that we might associate someone with being in, and to indicate the amount of resources a person has to spend on things like hobbies or vacations, and leisure activities. So we're going to be looking at a class structure that shows four classes in American societies, although different systems of stratification, of class stratification, sometimes include 3 to 6 or 7 classes in American society. So we usually start with the upper class. And for the upper class, it's sometimes also referred to as the 1%. Typically, there's a high standard of living. I'm actually posting a video for you that shows kind of how wealthy the upper class is, or the upper echelons of the upper class is, using rice, grains of rice. It's a pretty fun video. You might want to share it with friends. Um, but yeah, these are the people who are usually going to be associated with high culture, exclusivity, and dominant ideology, meaning that They control our ideology that justifies our social stratification system. Next, we have the middle class, which most Americans consider themselves to be in, although not everyone who thinks that they're middle class is actually middle class in the US, at least when you're using like the median household incomes and things like that. The middle class is educated. They usually have technical skills. They're homeowners who have health coverage, and all of these things are typically stable, right? So if you ever have lapses in these things, you may not actually be middle class. And typically, the middle class doesn't have any problems, meeting their basic needs. They can set up auto pay, perhaps, and not have to think about what bills are coming out of their account and whether that account will go negative. In contrast, the working class, which more Americans than realize they are um, may have some of the same characteristics as the middle class. They may have a home that they own or that they're mortgaging, but it's probably not as easy for them to make those payments. Or if something, an emergency or something urgent just comes up, then it will challenge like whether they're able to pay those bills or whether they will have health coverage or meet basic needs, right? So there's less stability there, but they can be similar to the middle class, especially in good times or when the society is in good times. And then finally, we get the lower class, or also known as the underclass or working poor. Typically, there's no stability here, definitely check to check. No or higher education or training, perhaps from any formal sources, and they may actually require assistance, public assistance. So one thing I do want to mention about the class system in the US is that there's good news and bad news. The good news is that in the United States, there is more wealth today than in the past. So, yay. The bad news is that access to that wealth has not improved and that the inequality gap is only getting larger. So, we're going to be talking about some ways that inequality is measured. Um, Momentarily, and I'm going to give you some videos for that as well. But I do want to point out that there's one that's not mentioned in your text, and that is the Gini index or coefficient. And we have this for every nation, and it measures, or almost every nation, those who contribute data. But it measures the level of inequality in a society, and it's on a scale from 0 to 1. So the closer a society is to 0, the more likely that society is to be equal, right? And no societies, no countries fall at 0, right? Most will be between 3 and maybe like 6. The closer it is to 1, that means it's completely unequal. If it's at 1, that means one household in the entire nation has all of the wealth, okay? So 0 means everyone in that nation has equal wealth, and 1 means one household has all the wealth and the others have none, right? So you can see why nobody's at 0 and nobody's at 1. But some nations are closer to 0 and some are closer to 1 than others. So I want you, when you get a chance, to go look up the GINI or Gini index for the United States and compare it to others. I'll put a map in, obviously, yes. I'm not just going to send you out on your own looking up Gini coefficients. But yeah, I would like to see, like, what do you think? Do you think the US comparably is, pretty unequal, or is it better than you thought it was? So social mobility is basically movement between social classes, right? If you're not in a system that has mobility, then you're not going to have any social mobility. I mean, I basically said the same thing twice. And when we talk about that social mobility, it could be based on any of those elements of SES or socioeconomic status that we talked about previously. Now, we as sociologists, of course, are going to complicate this a bit, and we're going to talk about the directionality and the characteristics of that mobility. So, the first thing we talk about is whether the mobility is horizontal or vertical, right? Now, horizontal, you might say, well, that doesn't seem like it's mobility because you're staying at the same class level. And that's kind of true. However, in societies where there's absolutely no mobility, you won't even change occupations. right? And so if you do live in a society that has at least horizontal mobility, there's the opportunity to move from one position to another, right? And although those positions may not be vertical or higher or lower, just similar, there is the option to move around and to change what you're doing. So horizontal mobility means that you do change occupations or positions, but your ranking doesn't change, right? Vertical mobility is both upward and downward. And often students get a little confused on this one because they think that vertical means up. Well, unfortunately, it also means down, right? And so vertical mobility means that you can move up in society and move up in rank, or that you could also lose rank and move down. Now, I'm going to make this even more complicated because there are generational aspects as well. We talk about social reproduction, which is basically the likelihood that people will do the same things that their parents or previous or future generations do, right? And so the ways or the terms that we use to discuss this is whether there is intra-generational mobility or intergenerational mobility. Intra-generational mobility, I like to suggest that students remember this by thinking of an intra-state highway or an intranet. That means within. Intra means within. So within one lifetime, one generation. So for basically one person, right? For an individual, what does your mobility look like? For your lifetime, intragenerationally, have you experienced horizontal mobility? Has it been vertical mobility? And if the latter, has it been up, down, round and round? Like what has your mobility looked like? Intergenerational mobility is like the internet or the interstate highway. It's between, right? And so, like just like a highway travels between, an interstate highway travels between multiple states, intergenerational mobility is looking at mobility between multiple generations. And so it could be a comparison between you and your parents, right? Between generations, what kind of mobility has occurred? Are you doing the same as your parents? Are you doing better or are you doing worse, right? And you can even do this across multiple generations. You can compare it to your children's life chances as well. Um, you know, yeah. Structural mobility looks at how societal changes allow for an entire group of people to move up or down. So this means that an entire social class might move up, like in the United States, where the working poor, thanks to labor unions, were able to move up and create a middle class, right? Um, so this kind of mobility is inevitable and it's due to changes in the economy, and you can see entire classes drop or rise. Unfortunately, in the US, the way it looks is that because of that inequality gap with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, that the wealthier could continuously move up in status for their structural mobility, and the poorer members of our society move down. And so that's why I was saying that many people who think that they are middle class or previously their families may have been middle class may not be considered middle class right now or today. Now, in the US, when it comes to mobility, we actually have less mobility than other wealthy nations. I'm sorry for that bad news. Most Americans today, most likely our children and Generation Z, I'm sorry, will experience social reproduction where you have similar outcomes to your parents. So, again, horizontal intergenerational mobility. The US now has less mobility than it did in previous generations. It's pretty obvious to see how much our wages have stagnated compared to inflation and like the cost of housing and things like that. And we can blame a lot of this on neoliberalism, which came into the picture in the 1980s. And so a lot of those like political changes of deregulation, of decentralization of government, of privatizing some of our social services and things like that, those were good for some, but not for the majority of us. So for most of us, all it's done is decrease our amount of mobility. So unless you're in like finance or investments and things like that, you're not on the good end of the stick there. So yeah, in the United States, a small portion of our population has the means to the highest standard of living. And the wealthiest 1% of the population holds 1/3 of our nation's wealth, while the bottom 50% of Americans hold only 2%, right? And then everybody kind of in the middle, but it's not the middle when you hear me say top 50 to 90% holds almost 2/3 of the nation's wealth. So yeah, hopefully I haven't depressed you too much. But there are ways that we can be active and, form collectives and organize and fight this and regain our mobility. So, yay, I'm hopeful. So, obviously, we can't talk about inequality without talking about poverty, right? Um, Even though we've had this huge rise in the standard of living in the United States, unfortunately, we haven't seen elimination of poverty. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are two ways of looking at poverty. And in the United States, both of these types of poverty exist. There's absolute poverty, which refers to a minimum level of subsistence that no family, no household, no individual should be expected to live below. So, absolute poverty might mean that you don't have access to safe um, housing, to food and water, or just a safe environment altogether. So, we call it absolute because no one can deny that this type of poverty is poverty. Relative poverty is more of a floating standard of deprivation where people at the bottom of a society or a subgroup of society, any kind of regional definition, whatever their lifestyles, are judged to be disadvantaged in comparison to others or in comparison to a nation as a whole or any other category, basically. So, relative poverty is just that, it's relative to who you're comparing the people to. So in the US, first of all, we acknowledge again that we do have absolute poverty. And for such a wealthy and powerful nation in the world, we have a lot of absolute poverty. It's really surprising to many how much and how overt our absolute poverty is. But many Americans kind of view the US's poverty as being relative poverty, and not just Americans, many people around the world, because globally we do see large concentrations of absolute poverty. And so relative poverty, again, it's a comparison, and it's at any level that one wants to compare. Typically, we talk about nations, right, a national level, but it can be any level. Something that we are aware of as sociologists are the circumstances of becoming poor, um, and how these differ for different demographics. We look at the connection between BIPOC or being a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, and how that influences um, poverty levels. Um, and we also look at gender as well. And these are just looking at two elements that can intensify poverty. We describe the gender difference in poverty as a feminization of poverty, acknowledging that it's more likely for women to become poor than men. So the feminization of poverty is the increasing proportion of poor people in the world that are women. And often it's because they are divorced or have never been married, because our system is patriarchal, and because of many sexist practices, the pay gap, or wage gap, the occupational gap and occupational segregation, and because of our social expectations that women's incomes are just supplemental, where men are actually the breadwinners. So for women, it can be traced back to their difficulty of finding childcare or the expectations that women will provide childcare, to sexual harassment, and to discrimination. During the pandemic, we saw this really intensely, and that many women were ones who lost their jobs first. And they were the ones who were expected to provide that home support for education, even if they were working, right? So, yeah. So we have talked a lot about inequality when it comes to the conflict perspective. So I'm not going to spend more time on that in this recording. You can actually go back to many of our previous recordings, actually, but definitely if you look at the recordings on social interaction in society and that first unit on introduction to sociology, you'll get a lot of that conflict perspective from Marx and from Max Weber. For the functionalist perspective, we actually look at the Davis-Moore thesis, or this theory that says that um, poverty can be functional, of course, because remember, inequality is functional, because if it wasn't functional for someone, it wouldn't exist, right? And so some stratification is often actually viewed as being functional, one, because it does benefit someone, that's why it continues to happen, and two, because some social stratification may be considered to be a necessity in order to motivate and incentivize work in certain positions that are harder or more difficult or more challenging. And so, for example, would people go to law school or go to medical school forever to do that work and be on call those hours if they weren't rewarded more than others? Maybe not, I don't know. The conflict perspective doesn't love that example, doesn't love that explanation. So, yeah. Interactionist perspective actually looks at this from the perspective of how people interact, of course. So, how people typically interact primarily with those who are in a similar social standing. Um, and also, and this is kind of my favorite area of the interactionist perspective here, how we symbolically communicate our social standing, right? And one of the ways that we do that is through something called conspicuous consumption, right? Basically, conspicuous consumption is very similar to the idea of status symbols. It's the act of buying and using products to make a statement about one's social standing. And so it's buying things not just to fulfill needs, but also to show someone something about who you are or what your status or identity is, right? And so a lot of our consumption, which brands we buy, what fashions, we wear and things like that, are more so about conspicuous consumption oftentimes than about actual need for things. So I think this is going to be our stopping point for the video. However, I'm going to add in some commentary as well in the next submodule about global stratification, and that will get us started for talking about global inequality after we come back from our exam during the following week. So thank you again, and look forward to seeing you in that next module. Bye.